Hello there, Mr. K, the mediocre painter here, and I've been painting miniatures for some 32 years, and I'm doing YouTube videos to try and help the beginner get into the wargaming hobby. And so today I'm going to be talking about priming your miniatures. If you've been watching the videos I've been doing, you'll know that I did a paint video where I talked about the paint you should buy and what miniatures you should buy when you're first actually about to paint. And that video is up here somewhere. And in there I describe what the paint process actually is, and we're following a 4-step process which is from a Games Workshop paint guide. And the first step is to prime, second step is to base coat, third step is to wash, and then the fourth is the details. Now, we're beginners and we are about to prime our miniature, and there's lots of videos out there about priming, about airbrush priming, rattle can priming, what colours you should use, and so on. Now, since we're a beginner, we don't really want to invest in an airbrush, so that's kind of out of the window. But should you use rattle cans to actually coat your miniatures? Well, I don't recommend them. They're a little tricky to use. Whilst they're efficient in terms of saving you time when you're painting hundreds and hundreds of miniatures, they're not that efficient in terms of the paint application. They tend to basically apply the paint a little bit thickly, and I have an example here of an Imperial Guard model that I bought some time ago for a kill team. You can see the paint's on this thing a little bit thickly. That's how it was when I purchased it, and it loses some of the detail on those older sculpted models as well. They're not quite as indented as the more recent miniatures, so you lose some of the detail when you have like a thick coat like that, and that's really, you know, exactly what you're trying to avoid. So since we're just humble beginners, I did another video. I described the sort of equipment that you needed to paint with, and you can see that here, and in that I mentioned that you're going to need to dedicate a brush for priming. It doesn't have to be an expensive brush, a cheap brush will do. This is a number 1, so it's a reasonable size. You certainly don't want to be using like a 000 or something to do priming in, because priming can be pretty hard on the old brush. So one of the reasons why we're going to use white today is because white never really fails you. So as a beginner, you're trying to eliminate as many mistakes as possible. White's great in that all whites in every single range are a good consistency, they water down well, they provide a really good base coat for things to be painted on. Indeed, ranges from Games Workshop in their base ranges, they do a very nice ceramite white, which is a really good base coat. You have to work it a bit because it's a bit thicker, but it's a very good base coat, dries very evenly and gives you really solid bond for paint subsequently. The reason why we need to prime is if you just paint the colours directly on, then basically they rub off, they'll scratch, etc. Whereas if you put a coat on first, the bond will be very strong, it won't chip and it won't rub off. Now you'll see videos out there about talking about using other colours like a black or a red even, or a grey is very popular too. Really, I'm not against using different colours when you prime. I think actually if it's going to save you time, it's well worth doing. So really, you should only prime in a different colour is going to save you a step. So like for example, you're painting fantasy dwarves, they've got heavy armour, you undercoat that with black, do a highlight in silver, and it looks freaking amazing, to be perfectly honest. And then same goes with something like skeletons, you do them in a bone, then you do a wash, and you know, highlights, and that's it, you're done, and it looks ace. So if the different colour saves you a step, well worth doing. But you have to have been in the game a little while to actually understand whether you can really get away with doing that or not. And since we're just beginners, we're going to start with white. One of the beauties of white is, you know, when you subsequently paint over the top of it, the colour will be the colour from the bottle that you're using. You may need a couple of coats, but it will look exactly like the bottle. If you use another colour, then basically you might have to use more coats, and also it'll be a bit flatter. Some of that ping in the colour will be taken away. So that's another good reason to use white. So, how do we actually go about doing this? Well, we're going to need our brush, our white paint. We're going to need a bit of plastic or something. This is a plastic lid. I'm not going to use a wet palette here, we're going to use a dry palette. You might not want to use a wet palette for the priming because you're going to end up using quite a bit of paint and it can dominate your palette. So, and it's a single step process too, so you don't really want to do that. You do need obviously water, jar of water. Good idea to have a clear glass as well. The reason why you want a clear glass is so that you can see your brush going into it, so you don't go all the way down. So it's a good idea that it's clear. So how do we actually get the paint how we want it? So we open the pot, obviously, and we take a couple of dips of paint with the brush and just watch it as you go in. You don't want to be taking the paint all the way down to the end of the brush. You want to be not covering the entire bristle, so don't go too far. Give a couple of blobs on there and then take your brush, dip it in the water, a couple of blobs of water. So you want, basically, roughly speaking, same amount of paint, same amount of water. And we're looking for a consistency that's a little bit thicker than the milk, basically, what we're looking for. And then we're just going to apply that to our mini. Now, when we're applying it to our mini, you know, we can be a bit haphazard. We don't have to worry too much about brush strokes. We can use stabbing motions, you know, to get in those little recesses and things like that in order to basically get that miniature covered. So that's one of the reasons why you want to use a cheap and inexpensive brush, because it's a little bit brutal on the actual brush. So do that on your mini. It should take you 5 or 6 minutes or something like that, and then move on to your next miniature, and then your next one, the next one. If you're doing a batch of 10, that's probably about right in terms of the time that you'll take. Little tip here, so when you move from one miniature to another, make sure you clean your brush through and then just dry it out and then start again. The reason for that is, you know, you might not think that the paint is actually drying on your brush, but it is. And so you want to just make sure that you don't wreck your brush, and so it's a good idea to pause in between those miniatures. Same goes when you're base coating as well, use the same principle, same idea. Another tip as well is, you know, you've got your paint on your palette, paint away until that goes. Make sure that you close your pot that you're using whilst you're using your palette, because chances are you'll knock it over. You don't want to leave it open. It's never wise to have paint open whilst it's on your palette. It will cause accidents. Remember, I've made the mistakes, so you don't have to. But maybe you're fancy Dan and you've got Vallejos and you've got the old dropper bottles, so you can just squeeze the stuff out, and if they fall over they don't tend to spill. It's another good reason why people like the old dropper bottles. Now, once you've done all your 10 minis, what you want to do is have a good look at the one that you did at the beginning and just check. And what you'll find is, when you're doing that, is, oh, you missed a bit. So just basically get in there and redo it. Or you may find there's a little bit of pooling here and there, where basically it's a little thicker. Maybe it's too thick and you don't really want that to happen. So just basically dry your brush off and pick up the excess paint with your brush, or you can have a little bit of water on your brush and just thin it down. When you're actually painting the miniature, what you might notice if you're using a plastic mini is that you get something called beading. And basically what that is that you've probably made too thin a mixture, and basically the plastic is repelling the paint. So just add a little bit more paint and then apply it back to that mini, and you should be a-okay and just fine. You also may find you get a little few bubbles here and there as well when you're doing it, because you're often using a stabbing motion. So basically just use your brush to get rid of those bubbles too. In terms of letting the minis dry, I have a tendency to do a little bit of priming in the evening, because that's the time I get and I don't get very long, so just do a quick prime, let them dry overnight and then come back to them. Very important to let the miniatures dry before you move on. Now, if you're a bit impatient, what you can do is put your minis under like a fan or in a breeze and something like that, and they will dry pretty rapidly. But you only want to do that when you've done your 10 and you've done your checks. And basically the reason why is, well, you don't want it to be completely dry and then realise you've missed a bit, because then you get a bit of an uneven coat. So you want to make sure that you don't really put them under the drying conditions that you're going to use until you're actually sure that that miniature is properly primed. So that's it. There's really not an awful lot to the priming process. You just need to prime the mini. You don't need to worry about the base really. So there's another little tip as well. And just to give you an idea of what it actually should look like at the end, here's an example orc here, and you can see that you can kind of see the plastic through the paint because it's thin, and that's the kind of consistency you're looking for, so you don't lose the detail, but it's still good enough to provide a solid undercoat for the subsequent paint to bond to it. Well, hopefully you find that interesting, and if you did, please like, please subscribe, and I'll see you next time.